page 192. The last thing we talked about is something I wanted to say more about, but I didn't have time to prepare it. So we'll see what I remember. That they explain now that Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, gave us two things. It gave us the mitzvos, and it gave us the letters. How do we see this? It says, Yaviu levush malchut, v'sus asher rachav alav hamelech, v'ilbishu et ha'ish. So you shall bring a royal garment and a horse upon which the king is ridden, v'ilbishu et ha'ish, and they should clothe the person with these two, with the garments, and have him riding on the horse.
Right, in the royal garb.
So he says that the royal garb, that's the mitzvos, the Torah and mitzvahs itself. As it says, he wears light like a garment. And the light is Torah. The Torah is a garment for Hashem to reveal himself in this world. Ubchinat levush le'oren sof baruch hu. For what is it revealing? It's revealing the light of the infinite. So the original, I was thinking the other day, it wasn't yesterday, it wasn't the day before, so sometime in the middle of the week when I was thinking about this mimer. So one of the things that came to mind is that the original picture of the Torah being a garment is from the sages saying that it's black fire on white fire. Like the letters themselves are like garments for the white fire. That only part of the whiteness is revealed to us. And what do we mean by part of the whiteness? That when you draw the white letters on the black letters with ink on a parchment, so it's like thinking about it like that the white parchment or the red parchment, depending on what you make the parchment out of, is like a light that's shining on you, and then the black letters, they conceal some of that light. So that's called a garment. That's the original, thinking that that's the original statement about the Torah being a garment. Not to mention, it's also made out of parchment. Parchment, obviously, is the garment of the animal, and it's the skin of the animal. So the Torah is a lessening of the infinite light. So the white light that's behind is like the infinite light. And what we read, we can only read the black letters. We don't know how to read what's between the letters. But there's even one calculation that when you say there's 600,000 letters in the Torah, you're really counting the letters and the spaces in between. Even then, you don't come to 600,000 exactly, but that's one of the directions. So that's the garment that the king wore, the royal garb. And the mitzvos are called levushim; they're called the garments of the king, and so on. And then, what does the horse represent? V'kiuman b'foal mamash olidei b'chinat sus. And the way that we actually perform them is with the symbol of the horse. Why the horse here? Because it says that Hashem, he came to give the Torah as it were on a chariot driven by horses. Obviously an image. What's this image trying to tell us? So the direction he takes here is that sus in Gematria is 126, so it's 2 times 63. And each 63 is like gas, it's like being ge'eh, it's like being prideful. That Hashem is able to reveal his pride, as it were. That he's above everything else. And that everything else has to be in bittul. So that's the quality we said that Avram has naturally, just by his very being, a varma, the organ of nullification. We get it from the Torah. And how does this work? That we feel, how did Hashem do this? That he when he appeared at Mount Sinai, it was like he was forcing us to take upon ourselves the power of commanding somebody gives that person the quality of being able to nullify themselves. If I'm not commanded, it's very hard for me to reach nullification. And that's something that I need. It's the same way that, for instance, it's like a coach in a certain sense. Like today, the watered down version of this is like that an athlete, a very good athlete, has a good coach. The coach knows how to force them to do things. It doesn't really force them. It's not like he's gonna take away their food, even though they do stuff like that. They used to do. a guy from the Romanian gymnast team used to starve the gymnasts.
Yeah?
Yeah, if they made a mistake, so they didn't have anything to eat. As it were, they didn't have anything to eat. But if they made a mistake, if they didn't do what he thought they were supposed to do, I can't remember his name, crazy guy, in 1976 Olympics, and eventually he was able to what do they call it when somebody got away from the Iron Curtain? Called it
Escape.
No, that's he didn't escape. He
Fled.
forgot what that was. It was very common in the 80s, this word, that somebody they used to come to a country and then not leave.
Right.
And they had a name for it. There was a name for it. I can't remember what it was called. Now it's gone in my vocabulary. So he moved to the United States in the 80s, and then he trained the American gymnast team for a while, gymnastics team. So a good coach, what he does is he gives you that power of nullification that you need in order to do more. That's why it's compared to a horse. He gives you the quality of being like a horse. The rider is able to nullify the horse. A good rider brings out from the animal the power of nullification that it has. And the horse has a tremendous power of nullification to the rider because it's willing to do crazy things if the rider's just confident enough in what they want to do. In fact, that's why today a lot of therapy that's done with children that can't control themselves is by teaching them how to ride a horse. Because basically controlling yourself is no different than controlling the animal. So they learn from controlling the animal how to control themselves. So it's a very powerful technique. So that's what the horse gives you. כי גאוגה דהיינו להיות על ידי זה בבחינת ביטול אליו יתברך, כי מצוות צריכות כוונה, דהיינו ראותא דליבה, אם ישים אליו ליבו. Because the mitzvot, they need a person to have nullification in the heart. The will of the heart comes from nullification. Well, we talked about many times that that's where the infinite appears. שאין אור אינסוף ברוך הוא שורה אלא במי שבטל אליו, because the infinite light, the limitless light, cannot dwell or cannot inspire anybody who's not nullified to it. So it's a necessary ingredient, like we saw by Avram. והנה עניין הסוס הוא שמוליך הסוס לרוכבו למקום שאין יכול להגיע לשם מצד עצמו. So the same idea that the horse, it's not just that you make this horse null to you. It's not just that you conquer the horse in such a way that it's nullified to the rider. But by nullifying it, the horse can take you somewhere you couldn't go by yourself, much quicker, much faster. And so that whole idea is what happens in the psyche when a person has self-nullification to God. Then Hashem, first of all, can appear in a place where he couldn't appear before, in the person who's down here. But for the person himself, he's able to do things that he wasn't able to do before. For instance, how can somebody who's flesh and blood contain the infinite? So the idea here is that by nullifying the way that the horse nullifies to the rider, you're able to contain the infinite inside of you. And there are two separate issues here. One is Shema Leu Harim Gdolim. The first one is that he can take you up and scale very high mountains with the horse. We'll see in a moment what that means. Umorido bekaot gdolot. And at the same time, he can also take you down into steep valleys. There's an incredible pasuk in the book of Kings, in 2 Kings, that the king Ram says to, I think it was to Elisha, I don't remember who he said it to. He said something about your God is only the God of I can't remember whether he said the mountains or the valleys. There's not much a statement like that. And the prophet who was talking to him said, you're mistaken. Our God is both the God of valleys and mountains. And this thing I think is a direct reference to that. What does it mean that Hashem is a God of both valleys and mountains? What does this image want to give us? So he says like this: "Kachine yesh bebchinat bitul zeh shtei bchinot, mimata lemala, lemakom she'en יניקה ואחיזה לסטרא אחרא, עלמא דחירות, גאה לגאותנה, שלא ניתן להם שפע וחיות אם תגביה כנשר." So first of all, there's from below to above, meaning that the power of knowledge can take you up to a place which is void of the sitra achra, which is void of the other side of the tuma, and take you that high. So that might be what everybody's looking for. That my nullification to Hashem will allow me to scale the levels of my spiritual existence in such a way that I'll be free of any kind of impairment that I have. And the impairment comes in the form of my Yetzer Hara, or whatever. So it takes me up so high. So that is like when Hashem had Geut, that he nullified Pharaoh's army, that he lifted them up to a very, very high place and dropped them from there. So he lifted them up into a place where they were nullified. They had no strength left. Rama lashon rememut and lashon ashlacha, and they threw them down. So that was the first instance of Hashem being both above and below, meaning he took them up to the highest level where they have no existence at all. And then he even cast them down into the lowest levels where they're just broken. And so it's called ashlacha, that you also threw them down. So what are these two? These two, in the nefesh, in the soul, in the psyche, they become what we call itkafia and itapcha. That to step down on them, that's itkafia, that's to submit them. That's when he cast them down. But to lift it up, itapcha, so that's to scale to such a high spiritual level where what was negative until now is no longer negative. So again, taking the image of the Egyptians in the sea, going up and down, bobbing up and down. So when they go up into the highest reaches, they're no longer Egyptians. Why are they taken up to that high level? So that the Jews can see them and see that they're rid of this now. They're no longer pursuing them. But then there's also the submission, which is to see them. They couldn't see them when this happened, but they went down into the depth of the ocean, of the sea there. So they're submitted. They have no strength left. So these two things, they happen in the psyche itself. That's like how to understand what the prophet said there in Second Kings. What he's saying is Hashem is both what allows you to submit and conquer the negative inside of you, but he's also able to lift you. Nullification is able to lift you to a place where the negative is no longer negative. It transforms into something positive. That's called itapcha, transformation. So it's a very important thing that nullification is not just, most people would think nullification is just for you to submit. He says, no, the real chap here, the real chiddush, is that it both takes you down and brings you up. So it's like, because really, how necessary is this, what he just said about the horse? It can take you down to the deep valleys of the mountains. You could just as well have said it can take you to long distances. So when he says that, he's not interested in what a horse can actually do. He's talking about what nullification can do. And the nullification can bring you both here and there. Both to itkafia, to be able to conquer your evil inclination, but more importantly, and more of a novelty, is that you can transform your evil inclination into something that's no longer evil, that is already something that serves you. It becomes your helper. So he says like this, להיות נמשך גילוי בחינת ביטול זה למטה דהתהפכה סטרא אחרא והתקפיה כולי, כי אי אפשר להיות התהפכות המידות על ידי המידות לקדושה עצמן, מאחר שהם זה לעומת זה. So you can't, so the chiddush here in Torah, again, this is more than what Avram had. Avraham had a natural tendency to be batal to Hashem. We don't have a natural tendency, but because we got the quality of nullification from the Torah, from Hashem coming, as it were, with a chariot of horses, what we got from that is the ability to transform the evil. That Avram couldn't do. Meaning, it's not just that we received nullification because not everybody has it naturally. But when you get it from the Torah, you get this added quality that you can actually change the evil inclination in you into something positive. And how do we see that Avram couldn't do it? So he says, because to transform, you can't just have something opposite. It's not just enough to have, okay, I also have holiness. Holiness doesn't necessarily transform the negative. It just puts something against it. It pits it against it. How do we see that Avram wasn't able to transform anything? Because it says, we see that Avram, for all his greatness, he couldn't transform the negative inside of him, and that's why Yishmael came out of him. Yishmael was a product of the negative midos that he wasn't able to transform.
There was no Sarah.
What?
There was no Sarah.
No.
Yitzhak was Avram with Sarah.
Good.
This was Avram and somebody else. So there was only a half of,
That I don't have a teretz for. But the shot is that even Avram still had something negative. Whether Sarah would have been able to do something with it or not is another question. But he himself still had something negative. So when the Yitzchak came out, it's fine. But he had negative qualities inside of him. Those negative qualities came out in Yishmael. When can you get rid of Yishmael? When can you get rid of the negative qualities? That can only happen when Hashem Himself gives you a higher light than what you have naturally. So even though Avram had this nullification naturally in him, it wasn't enough to be able to transform his negative traits. He was able to completely submit them. He was able to completely overcome them so that they had no expression in his daily life. But he wasn't able to transform them into something positive. And that's also why it was such a big chiddush that Yaakov was able to. How was Yaakov able to? Because Yosef was supposed to be, they were afraid that Yosef would become like Esau. Then here, Yaakov also has a son who he hasn't been able to transform, but Yaakov was able to. So one of the reasons is that usually Yaakov is associated with Torah for some reason. Tiferet is associated with Torah. So the explanation is, the real explanation is because he's on the middle axis. Everything that's on the middle axis has an ability to draw down the infinite light. Even though naturally, here we're like saying that naturally he has, even without the Torah. כמאמר לא קרה, כן, וזהו מרומז בדברי רז"ל, תבוא אמו ותקנח את בנה, כמו שכתוב, אם רחת השם, אל תקרא אם, אלא אם הבנים, היינו, אם הוא מקור המידות, היא בבחינת התבוננות באור אינסוף ברוך הוא ממש, בבחינת ביטול, ושם מתהפכים כל המידות מהפך להפך, לפי שהוא בבחינת מקיף, כמו על דרך משל, מחשבה שמקפת וסובבת שני דברים הופכים, אין שם שונה בבחינת זה לעומת זה. So the idea here is, he says the same thing is stated elsewhere when they say that the mother has to come and clean her son. So what does the mother represent here? The mother, the moichin, the mind. Because the mother principle, ima, is always bina. It's always understanding. So Avraham didn't have the understanding part of Torah, because the understanding part of Torah comes from the text itself, which he didn't have. He only did what he did naturally, out of himself. But he didn't have the text of the Torah. What he had was the ability to do certain things. So once the Torah already is here, so how are we able to transform our midos? How are we able to transform the evil into positive? That's through the understanding of the Torah. I mean, that's through the meditation and the contemplation of Torah in the sense of learning Torah. And that Avram certainly wasn't able to do, but that's what you gain. That's what you gain from Matan Torah. So we gain two things. One of this is that every person can now have nullification, therefore be a vehicle, be a vessel for the infinite light. And the second thing is that not only can we be a vessel for the infinite light, but we can also transform the negative inside of us. Why? Because of the Torah text. Because that's what learning Torah does. And again, this is not something that some people expect, that you open up a book and suddenly everything changes. It's not that simple. But after years of working with it, there's nothing else in the world that will change it. But after years of learning, it changes. And things begin to change. And the person is not the same person he was. And okay, so we didn't finish today. That will finish tomorrow.
Is Bitul and what's the other one? Bitul and...
Tafya and Itapcha were the two things we said. Submission.
Bitul is B'chokhmah.
Right. Bitul is B'chokhmah. Understanding.
Malchut.
We didn't say Malchut. I don't remember we said anything. We said...
No, I'm just saying what you did in Torah Tanifas. Bitul and
Ah,
Malchut.
Shiflut.
Shiflut, okay. Yeah. Shukr.